You've probably seen those terrifying plague doctor costumes. The glass eyes, the beaks, the long cloaks. Those guys are deeply associated with something dark and grim. But who are they really? Today, we're going to live through the day of the life of a plague doctor and discover that they were actually, well, kind of sweethearts who did genuinely good work. And if you're enjoying this dive into history, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and we got plenty of more fascinating stories just like this one. Meet our hero, Dr. Cornelius Greenwald. It's 6065 and he lives in the beautiful city of London. Cornelius' profession? Plague doctor. He lives on the outskirts of town in a rather wealthy house filled with expensive trinkets. At the local tavern, Cornelius drinks for free. And even the church, despite his provocative appearance, isn't rushing to drag Cornelius to the stake. And remember, this is the 17th century we're talking about, when burning people was still pretty standard practice. The reason is simple. Plague is ravaging throughout the entire continent, and Cornelius' job is to deal with the problem. Before we dive into the details, let's paint the full picture. Plague is a terrifying disease with nearly 95% mortality. First, a person feels pain and inflammation in their lymph nodes. Then, the lymph nodes swell up, and the patient develops fever. Within 2 to 12 days, the person will likely die. The inflamed lymph nodes, they look distinctive. And those swellings are called buboes, which is why the medieval plague is most often called bubonic plague in various sources. As you probably know, the most common way to catch a plague is through rat bite. But there is another, often more deadly carrier, fleas. They're small, they jump, they bite people, and the worst of all, they're excellent plague carriers. Humans carry it too. You can get infected through contact with an infected person or through airborne droplets. Today, plague is easily treated with various antibiotics, but the first vaccine wasn't tested until 1934, so our ancestors had it pretty rough. Contrary to the popular belief, plague isn't just a medieval nightmare, confined to dark ages and rats. It goes back much further. It's even mentioned in the Bible. In the book of Samuel 1, during the war between Israel and Philistine, it says, "The hand of the Lord was heavily upon the people of Ashdod. He has affected them and struck them with tumors. Those tumors were likely swollen lymph nodes, which is a classical sign of bubonic plague. The Bible saw it as a divine punishment, but modern analysts suggest it was deadly outbreak, possibly the earliest recorded description of the disease. Fast forward to 541 AD, and we see the first recorded pandemic, the plague of Justinian. It swept through the Byzantine Empire and beyond, killing over 100 million people over 3 decades, almost a third of the known world's population. The empire never fully recovered after that. Then came the most infamous one, the Black Death, in the 14th century. Between 1347 and 1352, it wiped out about 25 million people in Europe alone, 1 in every 3. Entire towns vanished. It reshaped economies, religions, and even the course of wars. But the plague didn't stop there. Outbreaks keeps returning for centuries. Even after the advent of the modern medicine, the disease continued its grim march. In India, from early 1900s until the late 1963, plague outbreak killed more than 12 million people, long after the invention of antibiotics. For most of the human history, plague has been an ever-present shadow. It moved with us, spread throughout the trade routes, stowed away in our ships, and struck people without warning. And while today it's treatable, it's a stark reminder that nature doesn't need an invitation to disrupt civilizations. But in London in 1665, our poor Cornelius couldn't boast of advantages of the modern medicine. All the rich heritage of Greek and Roman medicine had been successfully reduced to zero by the church, which considered it ungodly. When people got sick, they first called a priest, considering doctors to be eccentric. Hence, the wild mortality rates, which ultimately led to the emergence of the plague doctors like Cornelius. Prayers didn't help, and no matter how much people loved the church, it became obvious that something had to be done. Against the backdrop of hundreds of thousands of corpses, medicine somehow moved from a standstill through you couldn't call the progress groundbreaking. Treatment was largely trial and error. People practiced bloodletting. The especially clever ones smeared themselves with leeches. We'll talk about details later, but for now, let's move on to Cornelius' costume. Characteristic cloak and mask of a plague doctor weren't worn by all representatives of the profession. They were actually invented in 1619 by a French physician, Charles de L'Amour, who created that very equipment. For centuries before that, doctors wore wherever they had available. Our Cornelius is a good plague doctor, so he dressed up appropriately. On Cornelius's head sits a helmet that's essentially a prototype of a gas mask. It completely covers the head and eyes, protecting them with glass eyepieces. That famous beak that gives the costume its flair actually serves a useful purpose. Strong-smelling herbs and other medicines were stuffed into the beak. Doctors worked with patients who didn't smell particularly pleasant, and sometimes even with corpses, where it was basically necessary not to faint from the smell. And the part of the beak touching the nose was covered with a sponge soaked in various senses, and the doctor constantly chewed garlic. Moving on, we encounter the cloak, whose main idea was to protect the doctor's body. Cornelius, like all the representatives of his profession, didn't want to touch patients directly. This was helped by gloves, long fisherman boots, and cane. With the cane, they examined patients, treated the wounds, and when necessary, fought off particularly violent patients. Was the doctor plague costume effective? Partially, yes. As we mentioned, plague really is transmitted through contact, so covering the body is quite reasonable. In addition, Cornelius smears his clothing with fat and wax, which is genius in itself. The main disease carrier is fleas, and they can bite through such clothing. But the garlic is absolutely useless and doesn't save from plague at all, just like the beak, since we mentioned that the disease is easily transmitted through the air. Therefore, mortality rate among plague doctors was still high. So, what does a plague doctor's day consist of? Let's start with the fact that there are several different varieties. The first category, scavengers. One of the most frequent orders our Cornelius receives is removing and burying a corpse. Often, local lords from London call doctors to collect and remove the dead body and dump them somewhere in a canal. Along the way, Cornelius could take anything he wanted from their homes. Greed turned out to be weaker than survival instincts, and few people risk entering the homes of the dead. As a result, plague doctors, in addition to removing corpses, could help themselves to wherever they wanted. Removing corpses is only part of his work, but there were doctors who only did this. We'll just call them scavengers. The second category of doctors, which our Cornelius belongs to, are medics. Those guys really tried to help, but found themselves in a harsh framework of reality where medicine haven't developed for the past 500 years. Such doctors remove corpses but also try to treat patients, trying all kinds of different treatments on them. The problem is there are many inflamed lymph nodes and the operation is extremely painful. Plus, don't forget, they were operating in a plague-infected surface. However, in our plague doctor's career, there were successful treatment cases. It was believed that if the person recovered, God helped them, but if somebody died, it was the doctor's blame. Naturally, mortality exceeded the number of cured, and therefore our Cornelius lived on the outskirts and considered to be an outcast. Though, they still poured him free drinks out of respect for his profession. Some of the medic category plague doctors resorted to extravagant treatment methods. Some fed patients spiders, believing they absorbed the bad stuff. Others made them smell horse manure to kill the plague with a stench. The especially clever ones used cupping, applied frogs, and treated with leeches. There was also the third category of the plague doctors, visionaries. Those guys were quite educated people who tried to apply their genius to solve the problem. For example, the famous Nostradamus was such a learned doctor. Predictions were his hobby, but in reality, Michel de Nostradame was quite a gifted doctor. For his contribution to fight the plague, the Parliament of the French region gave him a lifetime pension. There were also other guys like Surgeon Fabricus Hildanus. When he discovered plague in himself, the guy isolated himself from society, and for a whole week he was systematically cutting and squeezing out the plague growths. It worked, and he tried to apply his knowledge in wide practice. Unfortunately, it did not work very well. The destruction of Roman heritage and the cult of the church weren't the only reasons for medical backwardness. Totally unsanitary conditions reigned in the world where not washing for a couple of months was normal, and dirt, as everyone knows, is flea's best friend. Plague doctors, even though they weren't practically loved, any city needed those guys. Therefore, our Cornelius Greenwald was never out of job. The guy's monthly salary was an outstanding 110 pounds. For a moment, that's 6.5 tons of beef A regular carpenter earned Cornelius' monthly salary in 2 years. For comparison, a whole year's rent of an elite apartment in a city center would be about £50. Even the lowest caste of a plague doctors had no money problem at all. The only problem was survival. Scientists still can't properly answer why, with such unsanitary conditions and zero medicine, plague didn't kill the entire planet. The most popular version is natural immunity development, similar to vaccines. Perhaps some people really caught weaker plague strains and rebuilt their immunity. But perhaps plague doctors really made their contribution through corpse disposal and maintaining at least some semi-balance of sanitation. So, our friend Cornelius Greenwald did good. He did all the dirty work with an enormous risk to his life. Perhaps, thanks to his treatment, some of our ancestors survived. So, let's give a Cornelius some likes under this video, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you very soon in a different video.